Jeffrey Epstein constructed and inhabited a functioning messianic system, not metaphorically but concretely. His behavior, worldview, and influence are best understood not merely as the actions of a manipulative predator, but as the enactment of a genuine delusional belief in his own ontological exceptionalism, that is, the belief that he was a fundamentally different kind of human being. This exceptionalism was not simply narcissistic grandiosity. It formed the foundation for a theological system in which he perceived himself as a world historical agent whose actions were morally justified, even redemptive, regardless of their transgressive appearance. In this system, Epstein's exploitation of others was not experienced as evil, but reframed as necessary within a narrative of redemptive inversion, where harm becomes good, taboo becomes sacred, and moral law is suspended for the sake of a greater purpose. He responded to accusation not with fear or strategic denial, but with persecution indignation, a sense that those who judged him were guilty of misunderstanding a sacred mission. His homes, his island, and particularly his temple, functioned as sacralized spaces, physically and symbolically set apart from the outside world, where a different moral logic operated. His actions, while criminal and predatory from the outside, were framed internally as part of a salvific timeline, a delusional, future-oriented logic in which he saw himself as advancing humanity through elite reproduction and genetic selection. This delusional structure integrated Christian theological content not as an adopted metaphor or external manipulation, but as an absorbed symbolic framework. Epstein's belief system matched the grammar of messianic theology: exceptional birth, chosen mission, persecution, sacrifice, and ultimate legacy. He did not need to explicitly identify as Jesus to inhabit the role. His interpretation of Christian symbols, stories, and structures likely emerged as confirmation of his identity. Once such a delusion stabilizes, anything that persuades others becomes integrated as prophecy fulfilled. The theology becomes personalized. The messianic elements at work in Epstein's system were not superficial resemblances. They followed the internal architecture of Christ ideation, refracted through a modern, elite, secular context. Epstein saw himself as chosen, not by God per se, but by destiny, intelligence, and power. His origin myth presented him as a self-made, brilliant outsider, echoing the Christian narrative of divine incarnation in humble form. His entourage included scientists, socialites, and carefully selected victims, all positioned to reflect and confirm his role. His teachings were not sermons but esoteric ideas about human improvement, eugenics, and global influence, ideas which functioned as sacred knowledge within his system. Just as Christ was rejected by the authorities of his time, Epstein framed legal and moral condemnation as blindness on the part of a morally inferior society. His persecution was, in this view, proof of his calling. And where the Christian Messiah promises eternal life and spiritual redemption, Epstein promised a genetically superior future and elite continuity. His notion of legacy was not fame or wealth, but lineage and transformation, a biological form of salvation. The core symbols of Christianity, revelation, sacrifice, chosen people, sacred place, were all present in translated form, forming a theologically structured but institutionally unmoored messianic cosmology. The system's coherence and persistence are explained through a series of triadic dynamics that reveal how psychological belief, symbolic meaning, and social structure interacted in self-reinforcing loops. For example, Epstein's obsession with controlled reproduction and eugenics was not merely eccentric. It was part of a soteriological framework, in which his own genetic material and selective choices were framed as instruments of human redemption. His belief that he was producing sacred progeny confirmed his ontological uniqueness and justified future-oriented interventions in human evolution. In this closed loop, reproduction became divine, identity became exceptional, and harm became necessary. His private spaces functioned not just as sites of secrecy, but as ritual enclosures. The island and the temple on it were architecturally and symbolically separated from the profane world, serving the same function that sacred spaces serve in religious traditions. They created a threshold across which normal moral law was suspended. This separation justified actions that would otherwise be condemned. Inside the temple, a different ethical regime prevailed, one grounded in the leader's authority, not in social norms. Furthermore, Epstein's systematic targeting of victims followed a consistent logic. The young and vulnerable were not selected randomly, they were chosen according to an ideological framework that required their harm to be reinterpreted as uplift. The abuse was framed as mentorship, initiation, or opportunity. The presence of this theodicy of harm, where suffering is not only justified, but sacralized, is a hallmark of messianic systems in which victims become instruments of cosmic transformation. His interactions with elites also followed a theological logic. His self-conception as a redeemer of humanity through science and power required apostolic validation. Billionaires, royals, and intellectuals became his disciples, not always knowingly, but functionally. Their presence and financial support confirmed his special role. And once they were entangled, their silence or defense of him became further evidence of his sanctity. This is not merely manipulation, it is the internal logic of a delusion that feeds on recognition to stabilize itself. Epstein's defensive posture when questioned or accused was not calculated avoidance. It was a righteous indignation characteristic of messianic figures who see themselves as above judgment. He responded not like a man with something to hide, but like one insulted by the suggestion that he should be accountable to common morality. His transgressions, far from being hidden or apologized for, were defended as necessary for a mission that the world was too blind to understand. Within this system, followers were not merely deceived individuals, they were structurally required components of the delusion. Messianic systems do not function in isolation. They demand mirroring, social reflection that confirms and stabilizes the leader's identity. The theory explains that followers were drawn not because they were foolish or misled, but because Epstein's system offered them solutions to unresolved psychological needs. For those experiencing existential doubt, identity confusion, or status instability, Epstein provided a role that resolved meaning. Many followers were able to offload moral responsibility onto Epstein. Once they allowed him to decide what was right or necessary, they were relieved of guilt. This moral delegation created loyalty not grounded in belief, but in psychological relief. Over time, this loyalty hardened into complicity, as followers became dependent on the system to protect them from self-reckoning. Their proximity to Epstein also offered social and professional elevation, which in turn created cognitive immunization. Criticisms were dismissed as envy, and accusations became threats to the group's shared reality. Group isolation, shared persecution narratives, and the inversion of moral norms created an environment in which reality itself was restructured. Outsiders were blind or evil, insiders were enlightened. This inversion prevented escape not just because of external pressure, but because departure required psychological collapse. To leave would be to admit that the system had been wrong, and that the follower had participated in harm. For many, reinterpreting reality was honestly easier than dismantling the structure that gave their life coherence. One of the most critical and difficult insights in the theory is that the abuse within Epstein's system was not merely exploitative, it was ritualized and sacralized. It served a theological function. The repeated acts of coercion, manipulation, and transgression were embedded in a logic of sacred violation. As in ancient cults and apocalyptic sects, such acts were not seen as wrong, but as necessary. The victims were not simply harmed, they were transformed into instruments of a greater plan. The architecture of the island, the secrecy, and the ceremonial nature of the environments all support the claim that these acts were understood internally as rites, not crimes. The temple in particular was not decorative eccentricity, it was a boundary marker. Across religious history, temples function as sites of law suspension, where the divine operates free from human constraint. Epstein's temple served the same purpose. It legitimized what was forbidden elsewhere. It defined who was in and who was out. And most crucially, it grounded the actions within it in a moral world apart. The most diagnostically decisive element is Epstein's tone of moral offense when questioned. This was not the reaction of a man engaged in deception. A psychopath might lie, avoid, or placate. A narcissist might defend his ego or project blame. But Epstein did neither. He responded with righteous anger, not fear. This is the hallmark of messianic delusion. The deluded Messiah does not believe he is merely innocent. He believes that to accuse him is to commit sacrilege. That tone, that posture is diagnostic. It reflects not strategy, but ontology. Epstein did not believe he was merely right. He believed he was the kind of being who could not be wrong. The theory ultimately provides a comprehensive and concrete explanation of Epstein's rise and influence. It reframes his system not as a criminal conspiracy alone, but as a fully formed, theologically structured cosmology in which he saw himself as the redeemer of a future humanity. The essential elements of Christian messianic theology, exceptional birth, sacred mission, persecution, sacrifice, future redemption, are all present, not metaphorically but functionally. His system was not only internally coherent, it was ritually enacted, socially mirrored, and morally inverted. This structure explains the behavior of his victims, his patrons, his silence, his persistence, and his extraordinary ability to retain power despite exposure. The system did not depend on deception alone, but on the existential needs it fulfilled for others. Followers did not simply believe his story, they needed it to be true. That is why it lasted. That is why it scaled. And that is why it is best explained not by pathology alone, but by the dynamics of secularized messianism grounded in Christian theological structure, enacted in elite systems, and stabilized through ritualized transgression.